You clicked for the moment Alexander's empire truly struck back. Not his enemies, but his own army. Right now, we're plunging into Arrian's Book 5 to witness the legendary mutiny that forced Alexander the Great to turn back from India. After years of relentless conquest, deep in the unfamiliar, monsoon-soaked lands of India, Alexander's Macedonian veterans had simply had enough. They'd faced war elephants and formidable kings like Porus, but this time, the enemy was within. Why, after such unprecedented success, did the greatest army in the ancient world finally say no to Alexander? We'll explore Arrian's first-hand account to uncover the true tipping point, the whispers, the speeches, and the dramatic confrontation that changed history forever. What pushed these hardened warriors to defy their legendary commander? This isn't just a battle, it's a profound human drama about limits, leadership, and the will of an army. If you've ever wondered how Alexander met his match, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more untold ancient history. The Anabasis of Alexander, Book 5. Chapter 1. Alexander at Nysa, an Introduction to India. In the land between the Kaphen and Indus rivers, a region traversed by Alexander, lay the city of Nysa. Tradition held that Dionysus founded Nysa after conquering the Indians. However, details about this Dionysus, his identity, the timing of his campaign, or his origin, remain unclear. It's difficult to accept that the Theban Dionysus, starting from Thebes or Lydia, could have led an army into India, conquering only the Indians among so many formidable, unknown nations. But when considering ancient divine legends, one shouldn't scrutinize them too closely with probability. What seems unlikely without divine intervention can become credible with it. When Alexander reached Nysa, the citizens sent their president, Acuphis, with 30 distinguished envoys. They sought to persuade Alexander to grant their city freedom for the gods' sake. The envoys found Alexander in his tent, still in armor and dusty from travel, helmeted and holding his spear. Awed by his presence, they prostrated themselves and remained silent for a long time. After Alexander bade them rise and be of good cheer, Acuphis finally spoke. "O king, the Nysians implore you, out of respect for Dionysus, to allow us to remain free and independent. When Dionysus conquered the Indians and returned to the Grecian Sea, he founded this city. He settled soldiers no longer fit for service here, inspiring them as bacchanals. Nysa was to be a monument to his travels and victory for future generations. Just as you have founded Alexandria near Mount Caucasus and another in Egypt. You have already founded many cities, and will find more, for your exploits surpass even those of Dionysus. The god named our city Nysa and our land Nicaea after his nurse. He called the nearby mountain Miros, meaning thigh, because legend says he grew in Zeus's thigh. Since then, we have lived in Nysa as a free city, governing ourselves with constitutional order. As proof that Dionysus founded our city, ivy grows here, which is not found elsewhere in India." Alexander was pleased by this account. He wanted the legend of Dionysus's journey to be believed, and Nysa's divine origin accepted. This would confirm he had reached, and even surpassed, Dionysus's farthest point. He also hoped his Macedonians, inspired to outdo Dionysus, would continue their campaign. Therefore, he granted Nysa its freedom and independence. After inquiring about their laws, he praised their aristocratic government. He requested 300 Nicean horsemen for his army and 100 of the 300 ruling aristocrats. He appointed Acuphis governor of Nicaea and tasked him with selecting the men. Acuphis reportedly smiled at this. When Alexander asked why, Acuphis replied, "O king, how can a city, deprived of 100 of its best men, remain well governed? If you care for Nicaea's welfare, take the 300 horsemen, or even more. But instead of the 100 best, take double the number of our worst men. Then, when you return, the city will appear in the same good order it is now." Acuphis's prudent words convinced Alexander. He commanded them to send the horsemen, but no longer demanded the 100 chosen men, or even others in their place. Instead, he ordered Acuphis to send his own son and grandson to join the army. Alexander then felt a strong desire to see the places where the Niceans claimed memorials of Dionysus. So he rode with his companion cavalry and foot guard to Mount Miros. He found the mountain covered with ivy, laurel, and dense groves of all kinds of timber, teeming with wild animals. The Macedonians were delighted to see ivy again, having not encountered it for a long time in India, even where vines grew. They eagerly made garlands, crowning themselves and singing hymns to Dionysus, invoking him by his various names. Alexander offered sacrifices to Dionysus and feasted with his companions. Some accounts, though perhaps unbelievable, state that many distinguished Macedonians, crowned with ivy, were seized by Dionysian inspiration during their invocations. They uttered Evoi in honor of the god and acted as bacchanals. One may choose to believe or disbelieve these stories. However, I disagree with Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who claims that all such tales of divine intervention were merely flattery for Alexander. Eratosthenes states that the Macedonians, seeing a cave in Paropamisus and hearing a local legend, or perhaps forming their own conjecture, spread the story that it was the cave where Prometheus was bound, and where Heracles freed him by killing the eagle. He also claims the Macedonians moved Mount Caucasus from the Euxine Sea to the east, and Paropamisus to India, calling Mount Paropamisus Caucasus to enhance Alexander's glory, suggesting he had crossed the true Caucasus. Furthermore, Eratosthenes writes that seeing oxen branded with a club in India led them to conclude Heracles had reached India. Eratosthenes similarly discredits the tales of Dionysus's travels. I will leave these stories unresolved. Upon reaching the Indus River, Alexander found a bridge constructed by Hephaestion, along with 2 30-oared galleys and many smaller vessels. Taxiles, the Indian ruler, had sent gifts: 200 talents of silver, 3,000 oxen, over 10,000 sheep for sacrifice, and 30 elephants. 700 Indian horsemen from Taxiles also arrived as reinforcements, and he offered to surrender Taxila, the largest city between the Indus and Hydaspes rivers. Alexander sacrificed to his customary gods and held gymnastic and horse contests near the river. The sacrifices were favorable for his crossing. Here are some unquestionable facts about the Indus River. It is the largest river in Asia and Europe, surpassed only by the Ganges, also an Indian river. The Indus originates on this side of Mount Paropamisus, or Caucasus, and flows into the Great Sea south of India. It has 2 mouths, both shallow, like the 5 outlets of the Ister, or Danube. It forms a delta in India, resembling Egypt's, called Padala in the Indian language. The Hydaspes, Aces Ines, Hydrotes, and Hyphasis are also Indian rivers, larger than other Asian rivers, but significantly smaller than the Industry. The Indus itself is smaller than the Ganges. Ctesias claims, if his evidence is reliable, that the Indus is 40 stades wide at its narrowest and 100 stades at its broadest, with most of it being an intermediate width. Alexander crossed the Indus with his army at daybreak into Indian territory. In this history, I have not described their laws, the strange animals their land produces, the types of fish and water monsters in the Indus, Hydaspes, Ganges, or other Indian rivers. Nor have I detailed the gold-digging ants, the guardian griffins, or other tales meant more for amusement than as factual accounts. The falsity of many fabricated Indian stories is difficult to expose. However, Alexander and his army revealed the untruth of most, though some of his own men created new ones. They proved that the Indians Alexander visited, many tribes of them, lacked gold and were not luxurious. They were tall as any men in Asia, most being 5 cubits or slightly less. They were darker than other peoples, except the Ethiopians, and were by far the bravest warriors among Asian races at that time. I cannot fairly compare the ancient Persians to the Indians, even though Cyrus, son of Cambyses, led the Persians to depose the Medes and subdue many other nations. At that time, the Persians were a poor people from a rugged land, with laws and customs much like the Laconian discipline. I cannot definitively say whether the Persians' defeat in Scythia was due to the difficult terrain, Cyrus's errors, or if they were truly inferior warriors to those Scythians. I will discuss the Indians in a separate work, presenting the most credible accounts from those who accompanied Alexander and from Nearchus, who sailed around the Great Sea near India. I will then add information from Megasthenes and Eratosthenes, two highly respected authorities. I will describe Indian customs, unique animals, and the sea voyage itself. For now, I will include only what is necessary to explain Alexander's achievements. Mount Taurus divides Asia, starting from Mycale, opposite Samos. It cuts through Pamphylia and Cilicia, extending into Armenia, then Media, and through the lands of the Parthians and Chorasmians. In Bactria, it joins Mount Paropamisus, which Alexander's Macedonians called Caucasus to enhance their king's glory, claiming he had conquered beyond the Caucasus. Perhaps this range is a continuation of the other Caucasus in Scythia, just as the Taurus itself is continuous. For this reason, I have previously called this range Caucasus and will continue to do so. This Caucasus extends to the Great Sea, which lies towards India and the east. Of the significant Asian rivers originating in the Taurus and Caucasus, some flow north into Lake Maeotis or the Hyrcanian Sea, which is a gulf of the Great Sea. Others flow south, the Euphrates, Tigris, Indus, Hydaspes, Acesines, Hydrotes, Hyphasis, and all rivers between these and the Ganges. All these either flow into the sea or disappear into marshes, like the Euphrates. Anyone who divides Asia by the Taurus and Caucasus from west to east will find two large divisions, one sloping south and the other north. Southern Asia can be further divided into four parts, of which Eratosthenes and Megasthenes consider India the largest. Megasthenes, who lived with Subertius, the viceroy of Arachosia, states he frequently visited Sandricotis, king of the Indians. These authors say the smallest of the four parts is bounded by the Euphrates, extending to our inland sea. The other two parts, between the Euphrates and Indus, are barely comparable to India, even combined. They state India is bounded to the east and southeast by the Great Sea, to the north by Mount Caucasus, where it joins the Taurus, and to the west and northwest by the Indus River, as far as the Great Sea. Most of India is a plain, which they believe was formed by river alluvial deposits. This is similar to coastal plains elsewhere, formed by individual rivers. Consequently, ancient names of regions were often derived from rivers. For example, a plain in Asia, near the Aeolian city of Smyrna, was named after the Hermus River, which rises from Mother Dindymene and flows into the sea. Another Lydian plain is named after the Caister, a Lydian river, another after the Caicus in Mysia, and the Carian plain, extending to Miletus, is named after the Meander. Historians Herodotus and Hecataeus, if the work on Egypt is indeed Hecataeus's, similarly call Egypt a gift of the river. Herodotus offers clear proof of this, suggesting the country itself may have been named after the river. Homer confirms that the river now called the Nile was anciently named Aegyptus, stating that Menelaus anchored his ships at the mouth of the Aegyptus. If single, not particularly large rivers can form extensive plains by carrying silt and mud from higher regions into the sea, surely we should not doubt how India, with its vast plains, was formed by its rivers' alluvial deposits. Even if the Hermus, Caister, Caicus, Meander, and all other Asian rivers flowing into the Mediterranean were combined, their volume would not compare to a single Indian river. I speak not only of the Ganges, the largest, which surpasses even the Egyptian Nile and the European Ister, but even all these combined would not equal the Industry. The Indus is a large river from its source, and after receiving 15 tributaries, all larger than rivers in Asia Minor, it flows into the sea, retaining its name and absorbing those of its tributaries. These remarks on India suffice for now. The rest will be in my description of India. Neither Aristobulus nor Ptolemy, my usual sources, explain how Alexander bridged the Industry. I cannot determine if it was a bridge of boats, like Xerxes's across the Hellespont or Darius's across the Bosporus and Ister, or a continuous bridge. It seems probable it was a boat bridge, as the water's depth would hinder a regular bridge, and such a massive construction couldn't be completed so quickly. If it was a boat bridge, I'm unsure if simply fastening vessels together in a row sufficed, as Herodotus describes for the Hellespont, or if it was built like the Roman bridges over the Ister, the Celtic Rhine, or the Euphrates and Tigris whenever needed. I know the Romans found boat bridges the fastest method, and I will now describe this technique, as it is worth explaining. At a prearranged signal, the vessels are released downstream, stern first. The current naturally carries them, but an oared skiff holds them back until they are positioned. Then, pyramidal wicker baskets filled with unhewn stones are lowered from each vessel's prow to anchor it against the current. Once a vessel is secured, another is similarly moored, prow upstream, at a distance allowing them to support a covering. Timber pieces with sharp ends are placed across both vessels, and then cross planks bind them together. This process continues for all vessels needed to bridge the river. At each end of the bridge, firmly fixed gangways are extended to provide a safer approach for horses and pack animals, and to reinforce the bridge structure. The entire construction is quickly finished with much noise and activity, yet discipline is maintained. In each vessel, the overseer's encouragement or censure of idleness does not prevent orders from being heard or impede the work's speed. Chapter 2. March to the Hydaspes and Encounter with Porus. The method I just described is how Romans built bridges in ancient times. However, the accounts from Alexander's army offer no details on how he bridged the industry. I believe his bridge was similar to what I've described, or if by some other ingenious means, then so be it. After crossing the Indus, Alexander offered sacrifices as was his custom. He then proceeded to Taxila, a large and prosperous city, the greatest between the Indus and Hydaspes rivers. He was warmly welcomed by Taxiles, the city's governor, and the local Indians. Alexander granted them additional territory as requested. Envoys also arrived from Abasares, king of the mountain Indians, including his brother and other notable men. Further envoys came from Doxarius, a provincial chief, bearing gifts. At Taxila, Alexander again offered his customary sacrifices and held athletic and equestrian contests. He appointed Philip, son of Machadas, as viceroy of the region's Indians, left a garrison, and placed his 6 soldiers in Taxila. Then, he marched towards the Hydaspes River. He had learned that Porus, with his entire army, was on the opposite bank, determined to prevent his crossing or attack him during the attempt. Upon learning this, Alexander sent Caenis, son of Polemocrates, back to the industry. Caenis was ordered to dismantle all the vessels used for the Indus crossing and bring them to the Hydaspes. Caenis did so, cutting the smaller vessels into 2 parts and the 30-oared galleys into 3. These sections were transported by wagons to the Hydaspes bank, reassembled, and launched as a fleet on the river. Alexander then advanced with the forces he had brought to Taxila, along with 5,000 Indians under Taxiles and other local chiefs, towards the same river. Alexander encamped on the Hydaspes bank. Across the river, Porus was visible with his entire army and a large contingent of elephants, guarding the passage where Alexander had set up camp. Porus also dispatched guards to all other easily fordable parts of the river, placing officers in charge of each detachment, resolved to obstruct the Macedonians' passage. Seeing this, Alexander decided to move his army in various directions to distract Porus and keep him guessing. He divided his forces, leading some troops one way, then another, at times ravaging the enemy's country, at others searching for an easier ford. He entrusted the rest of his troops to his generals, sending them in multiple directions. He also gathered grain from all sides into his camp from the land on his side of the Hydaspes. This was intended to convince Porus that Alexander planned to remain quiet until winter, when the river waters subsided, allowing for passage in many places. As Alexander's vessels sailed up and down the river, and skins were filled with hay, and the entire bank appeared covered in some places with cavalry and in others with infantry, Porus was prevented from resting or concentrating his defenses at any single point he might choose. Moreover, during this season, all Indian rivers were swollen, turbid, and swift. It was the time of year when the sun turns towards the summer solstice, bringing incessant and heavy rains in India. The melting snows on the Caucasus, the source of most rivers, greatly swelled their streams. In winter, however, they recede, becoming smaller and clearer, and fordable in certain places, with the exception of the Indus, Ganges, and perhaps one or two others. At any rate, the Hydaspes become fordable. Alexander therefore spread a rumor that he would wait for winter if his passage was currently obstructed. Yet, all the while, he lay in ambush, hoping to steal a crossing undetected through rapid movement. He realized he could not cross where Porus himself was encamped due to the multitude of elephants and Porus's large, splendidly equipped army ready to attack his men as they emerged from the water. He also feared his horses would refuse to ascend the opposite bank, as the elephants would immediately confront them, terrifying them with their appearance and trumpeting. Even before that, he worried the horses would not remain on the inflated hides during the river crossing. Seeing the elephants across the river, they would become frantic and leap into the water. He therefore decided to steal a crossing using the following maneuver. At night, he led most of his cavalry along the bank in various directions, making a clamor and raising the battle cry in honor of Enyalius. All sorts of noise were made, as if preparing for a full river crossing. Porus also marched along the river with his elephants opposite the sounds. Alexander thus gradually accustomed Porus to moving his forces in response to the noise. But when this happened frequently, with only clamor and battle cries, Porus ceased moving to meet the expected cavalry advance. Realizing his fears had been unfounded, he remained in his camp, though he still posted scouts at many points along the bank. Once Alexander had convinced Porus that his nocturnal attempts were no longer a threat, he devised a new stratagem. On the Hydaspes bank was a projecting headland where the river made a significant bend. It was densely covered by a grove of all kinds of trees. Directly opposite it in the river was a treed island, uninhabited and without a track. Realizing this island was directly in front of the headland, and both spots were wooded and suitable for concealing his crossing attempt, Alexander decided to move his army there. The headland and island were 150 stades from his main camp. He posted sentries along the entire bank, spaced to remain visible to each other and easily transmit orders. For many nights, clamor was raised and fires burned from all sides. But when he decided to cross the river, he openly prepared for a crossing opposite his main camp. Craterus was left at the camp with his cavalry division, horsemen from Aracocians and Parapamacedians, Alcidases and Polysperchans brigades from the Macedonian infantry phalanx, and Indian chiefs from this side of the Hyphasis, with 5,000 men. Alexander ordered Craterus not to cross until Porus moved his forces against them, or until he learned Porus was in flight and they were victorious. However, Alexander instructed, if Porus takes only part of his army against me, leaving the rest with the elephants in his camp, then you also remain in your position. But if he leads all his elephants against me, and part of his army remains in camp, then cross the river with all speed. For it is only the elephants, he explained, that prevent the horses from landing on the other bank. The rest of the army can easily cross. Such were Craterus's orders. Between the island and the main camp where Craterus remained, Alexander stationed Meleager, Attalus, and Gorgias with the Grecian mercenaries, cavalry, and infantry. He instructed them to cross in detachments, breaking up their army as soon as they saw the Indians engaged in battle. Alexander then selected his companion bodyguard, the cavalry regiments of Hephaestion, Perdiccas, and Demetrius, cavalry from Bactria, Sogdiana, and Scythia, and Don horse archers. From the infantry phalanx, he chose the shield-bearing guards, the brigades of Clitus and Caenus, with archers and Agrianians. He made a secret march, keeping far from the river bank to avoid being seen, heading towards the island and headland, his chosen crossing point. There, during the night, skins were filled with hay procured earlier and tightly stitched. A furious rainstorm erupted that night, further concealing his preparations and crossing attempt. The thunder and storm drowned out the clatter of weapons and the noise of officers' commands. Most of the vessels, including the 30-oared galleys, had been cut into pieces by his order, brought to this spot, reassembled, and hidden in the wood. At daybreak, both wind and rain subsided. The army crossed opposite the island, cavalry on skins, and as many foot soldiers as the boats could carry. They proceeded so secretly that Porus's sentinels did not notice them until they were past the island and close to the opposite bank. Alexander himself embarked in a 30-oared galley, accompanied by Perdiccas, Lysimachus, his confidential bodyguards, Seleucus, one of the companions later a king, and half of the shield-bearing guards. The rest of these troops were conveyed in other galleys of the same size. Once past the island, the soldiers openly steered towards the bank. When the sentinels spotted them, they immediately rowed off to Porus at top speed. Alexander was the first to land. He immediately assembled the cavalry as they disembarked from his and the other galleys, drawing them into proper order. The cavalry had been ordered to land first, and Alexander advanced at their head in regular formation. However, due to unfamiliarity with the terrain, he had landed on what he thought was the mainland, but was actually a large island. Its island nature helped him escape detection more easily. It was separated from the rest of the land by a shallow part of the river. Yet the furious rainstorm, which had lasted most of the night, had swollen the water so much that his cavalry could not find the ford. Alexander feared he would face another crossing as difficult as the first. When the ford was finally discovered, he led his men through it with great difficulty. Where the water was deepest, it reached above the infantry's chests, and only the horses' heads remained above the river. After crossing this stretch of water, he selected his chosen cavalry guard and the best men from other cavalry regiments, bringing them from column to line on the right wing. In front of all the cavalry, he posted the horse archers. Next to the cavalry, in front of the other infantry, he placed the royal shield-bearing guards under Seleucus's command. Near these, he positioned the royal foot guard, and next to them, the other shield-bearing guards, in their order of precedence. His archers, Arrianians, and javelin throwers were posted on each side, at the extremities of the phalanx. Chapter 3: Battle of the Hydaspes and Aftermath. With his army thus arrayed, Alexander ordered the infantry, numbering nearly 6,000, to follow slowly and in order. Believing himself superior in cavalry, he took only his 5,000 horsemen and led them forward swiftly. He also instructed Tauron, commander of the archers, to follow quickly to support the cavalry. Alexander reasoned that if Porus engaged with all his forces, he could easily defeat him with a cavalry attack or hold defensively until his infantry arrived. If the Indians were alarmed by his audacity in crossing the river and fled, he could pursue them closely, ensuring a greater slaughter and leaving little for his main force. Aristobulus claims that Porus's son arrived with about 60 chariots before Alexander's final crossing from the large island. He could have hindered Alexander, who struggled even unopposed, if the Indians had dismounted and assaulted those emerging from the water. Instead, the chariots passed by, making the passage safe for Alexander. Upon reaching the bank, Alexander deployed his horse archers against the Indian chariots, routing them easily with many wounded. Other writers claim a battle occurred between Alexander's cavalry and the Indians under Porus's son, that the son brought a larger force, wounded Alexander himself, and killed his beloved horse, Bucephalus, also wounded by Porus's son. However, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, whose account I favor, differs. Ptolemy also says Porus dispatched his son, but not with merely 60 chariots. It's unlikely Porus, hearing from his scouts that Alexander or part of his army had crossed the Hydaspes, would send only 60 chariots. This number was too large for reconnaissance and too slow for a quick retreat, yet far too small to hold back those still crossing or attack those already landed. Ptolemy states Porus's son arrived with 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots, but Alexander had already completed his final passage from the island before their appearance. Ptolemy further states that Alexander first sent his horse archers against them and led the cavalry himself, believing Porus was approaching with all his forces, and this cavalry unit was his vanguard. But once he accurately assessed the Indian numbers, he swiftly charged them with his surrounding cavalry. When they saw Alexander and his cavalry assault them, Not in a regular battle line, but by squadrons, they gave way. 400 of their cavalry, including Porus's son, fell. The chariots were also captured, horses and all, being heavy and slow in retreat and useless in the muddy ground. When the horsemen who escaped brought news to Porus that Alexander had crossed the river with his strongest forces, and his son was killed, he was still indecisive. This was because Craterus's men were seen attempting to cross from the main camp directly opposite his position. Nevertheless, he finally chose to march against Alexander with his entire army, seeking a decisive conflict with the strongest Macedonian division led by the king himself. However, he left a few elephants and a small force at the camp to deter Craterus's cavalry from crossing. He then took 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, 200 elephants, and 30,000 elite infantry, and marched against Alexander. Finding a place free of clay, with level, hard sand suitable for cavalry maneuvers, he arrayed his army. He placed the elephants in front, each spaced at least a plethrum apart, extending before the entire infantry phalanx to instill terror among Alexander's cavalry. He believed no enemy would dare penetrate the gaps between elephants. Cavalry would be deterred by frightened horses, and infantry would be repelled by heavy-armed soldiers or trampled by turning elephants. Behind the elephants, not in line with them, he positioned his infantry in a second line, just far enough back for companies to advance into the gaps between the beasts. He also placed infantry units beyond the elephants on the wings, and on both sides of the infantry, he posted his cavalry, with the chariots positioned in front of the cavalry on both wings. Such was Porus's deployment. As soon as Alexander saw the Indians in battle array, he halted his cavalry's advance to allow his arriving infantry to catch up. Even when the phalanx, marching swiftly, joined the cavalry, he did not immediately deploy and attack. He didn't want to engage exhausted and breathless men against fresh, untired barbarians. Instead, he allowed his infantry to rest and regain strength, riding around the lines to inspect them. After surveying the Indian formation, he decided not to attack the center, where the elephants and a dense phalanx were positioned. He was wary of the very arrangements Porus had made there. But being superior in cavalry, he took the greater part of that force and marched against the enemy's left wing for an attack. Against the right wing, he sent Caenus with his own and Demetrius's cavalry regiments, instructing them to stay close behind the barbarians when they, seeing the dense mass of cavalry, rode out to fight. Seleucus, Antigenes, and Tauron were ordered to lead the infantry phalanx, but not to engage until they saw the enemy's cavalry and infantry phalanx disordered by Alexander's own cavalry. When within missile range, he launched 1,000 horse archers against the Indian left wing, aiming to throw them into confusion with a constant barrage of arrows and a cavalry charge. Alexander himself, with the companion cavalry, rapidly advanced against the barbarian left wing, eager to attack their flank while still in disarray, before their cavalry could deploy. Meanwhile, the Indians had gathered their cavalry from all parts and were riding out of position to meet Alexander's charge. Caenus also appeared in their rear, as instructed. Seeing this, the Indians were forced to make their cavalry line face both ways, the largest and best part against Alexander, while the rest wheeled to face Caenus and his forces. This immediately threw the Indian ranks and their decisions into confusion. Alexander, seizing the opportunity the moment the cavalry wheeled, attacked those opposite him with such vigor that the Indians could not sustain his cavalry's charge. They scattered and fled towards the elephants, seeking refuge as if behind a friendly wall. Upon this, the elephant drivers urged their beasts forward against the cavalry. But now, the Macedonian phalanx itself advanced against the elephants, casting darts at the riders and striking the beasts from all sides. The action was unlike any previous combat. Wherever the beasts could turn, they rushed into the infantry ranks and broke the dense Macedonian phalanx. The Indian cavalry, seeing the infantry engaged, rallied and advanced against the Macedonian cavalry. But when Alexander's men, superior in strength and discipline, overcame them a second time, they were again repulsed towards the elephants and trapped among them. By this time, all of Alexander's cavalry had converged into a single squadron, not by command, but by the natural course of the battle. Wherever they struck the Indian ranks, great slaughter ensued. The beasts, now confined to a narrow space, injured their own as much as their foes, trampling them in their turning and pushing. Consequently, a great slaughter of cavalry occurred, trapped around the elephants. Most elephant keepers had been killed by javelins, and some elephants themselves were wounded. Others, maddened by pain or lacking keepers, no longer kept a part in battle. Instead, frantic with agony, they rushed at friends and foes alike, pushing, trampling, and killing them in every way. However, the Macedonians retreated when assailed, attacking the beasts in more open ground and according to their own plan. When the elephants turned to retreat, they pursued closely and hurled javelins at them. The Indians retreating among the elephants, however, suffered greater injury from them. But when the beasts tired and could no longer charge vigorously, they began to withdraw, facing the foe like ships backing water, merely uttering a shrill piping sound. Alexander himself surrounded the entire line with his cavalry and signaled his infantry to link their shields, forming a densely closed body and advance in phalanx. By this means, most of the Indian cavalry was utterly destroyed, as was the infantry, as the Macedonians now pressed upon them from all sides. Upon this, all who could fled through the gaps between Alexander's cavalry units. At the same time, Craterus and the other officers Alexander had left on the Hydaspes bank crossed the river, seeing Alexander's brilliant victory. These fresh troops pursued the retreating Indians, instead of Alexander's exhausted men, inflicting no less a slaughter. Of the Indians, nearly 20,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry were killed in this battle. All their chariots were shattered. 2 sons of Porus were slain, as were Spitaces, the region's Indian governor, the elephant and chariot managers, and all of Porus's cavalry officers and generals. All elephants not killed were captured. Of Alexander's forces, about 80 of the 6,000 infantry in the initial attack were killed, 10 of the horse archers, who also engaged first, about 20 of the companion cavalry, and about 200 of the other horsemen. Porus, who displayed great skill in battle, acting as both general and valiant soldier, observed the slaughter of his cavalry, some elephants dead, others leaderless and wandering, and most of his infantry perished. Yet, he did not flee like Darius the great king, setting an example of flight for his men. Instead, as long as any Indian unit remained compact, he continued to fight. But at last, having received a wound on his right shoulder, the only unprotected part of his body during the battle, he turned his elephant around and began to withdraw. His coat of mail, extraordinary in strength and fit, as later observers confirmed, had protected the rest of his body. Alexander, recognizing Porus as a great and valiant man in battle, greatly desired to save his life. He first sent Taxiles the Indian to him. Taxiles rode as close to Porus's elephant as seemed safe and urged him to stop the beast, assuring him that flight was impossible and bidding him listen to Alexander's message. But seeing his old foe Taxiles, Porus turned and prepared to strike him with a javelin. He likely would have killed him had Taxiles not quickly ridden his horse out of reach. Alexander was not angered by Porus's reaction. He continued sending others, and finally Meroes, an Indian, whom he knew to be an old friend of Porus. As soon as Meroes delivered the message, and overcome by thirst, Porus stopped his elephant and dismounted. After drinking water and feeling refreshed, he ordered Meroes to lead him directly to Alexander. When Alexander heard Meroes was bringing Porus, he rode forward with a few companions to meet him. Halting his horse, he admired Porus's handsome figure and stature, which was somewhat over 5 cubits. He was also surprised that Porus seemed undaunted, advancing as one brave man would meet another brave man, having gallantly defended his kingdom against another king. Alexander then spoke first, asking what treatment Porus desired. The report says Porus replied, "Treat me, O Alexander, in a kingly way." Pleased by this, Alexander said, "For my own sake, O Porus, you shall be so treated, but for your own sake, demand what pleases you." Porus replied that everything was included in that. Alexander, even more pleased, not only granted him rule over his own Indians, but also added another, larger country to his previous domain. Thus, he treated the brave man in a kingly manner and found him faithful ever after. Such was the outcome of Alexander's battle with Porus and the Indians beyond the Hydaspes River, fought during Hegemon's archonship in Athens, in the month Munician, April 18th to May 18th, 326 BC. Alexander founded 2 cities, one at the battle site, which he named Nysa after his victory over the Indians, and the other at the crossing point of the Hydaspes, named Bucephala in memory of his horse, Bucephalus. Bucephalus died there not from battle wounds, but from toil and old age, being about 30 years old and utterly exhausted. Bucephalus had endured many hardships and dangers with Alexander over many years, ridden only by the king because he rejected all other riders. He was exceptionally large and spirited. An ox's head was engraved on him as a distinguishing mark, which some say explains his name. Others say he was black, but had a white mark on his head greatly resembling an ox's head. In the land of the Uxians, this horse once disappeared. Alexander then issued a proclamation throughout the country, threatening to kill all inhabitants unless they returned the horse. As a result, it was immediately brought back. Such was Alexander's attachment to the horse, and so great was the barbarians' fear of Alexander. I have paid this much honor to Bucephalus for the sake of his master. Chapter 4. Further Conquests and Diplomatic Contacts in India. Having duly honored the fallen, Alexander offered customary sacrifices to the gods in gratitude for his victory. He then celebrated gymnastic and equestrian contests on the Hydaspes bank at his initial crossing point. Leaving Craterus with a portion of the army to erect and fortify the new cities, Alexander marched against the Indian nations bordering Porus's domain. Aristobulus called them Glaugonicians, while Ptolemy referred to them as Glausians. The name is of no consequence to me. Alexander traversed their land with half the companion cavalry, picking men from each infantry phalanx, all horse bowmen, Agrianians, and archers. All inhabitants surrendered, leading him to capture 37 cities. The smallest of these had no fewer than 5,000 inhabitants, and many numbered over 10,000. He also took numerous villages as populous as the cities. This land was also granted to Porus to rule. After reconciling Taxiles and Porus, Alexander sent Taxiles back home. At this time, envoys arrived from Abyssares, announcing their king's readiness to surrender himself and his territory. Prior to the battle with Porus, Abyssares had intended to join forces with him. Now he sent his brother with other envoys to Alexander, bringing money and 40 elephants as gifts. Envoys also arrived from independent Indian tribes and another Indian ruler named Porus. Alexander ordered Abyssares to come to him as soon as possible, threatening that if he failed to appear, Alexander would arrive with his army, a sight he would not welcome. Around this time, Phrataphernes, viceroy of Parthia and Hyrcania, joined Alexander with the Thracians who had been left with him. Messengers also came from Cyzicus, viceroy of the Assassinians, informing him that his people had killed their governor and revolted from Alexander. Against these, Alexander dispatched Philip and Tiriaspes with an army to stabilize the region. He himself advanced towards the Acesines River. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, uniquely describes the size of this Indian river, stating that where Alexander crossed it with boats and skins, the current was swift, and the channel was filled with large, sharp rocks, over which the water violently surged and dashed. He adds that its breadth was 15 stades. Those who crossed on skins had an easy passage, but many crossing in boats perished, with numerous boats wrecked and shattered on the rocks. From this description, one can infer that the Indus's size has been accurately reported by those who estimate its average breadth at 40 stades, but that it narrows to 15 stades where it is deepest, and that this width is found in many places along the Industry. I conclude that Alexander chose the widest part of the Acesines, hoping to find a slower current. After crossing the river, he left Cenis with his brigade on the bank, instructing him to oversee the passage of the army's rear, which had been left to gather grain and supplies from the already subdued Indian territory. He now sent Porus back to his home, ordering him to select the most warlike Indians, gather all his elephants, and rejoin him. Alexander decided to pursue the other Porus, the bad one, with the lightest troops in his army, having learned that he had abandoned his land and fled. This Porus, during the hostilities between Alexander and the other Porus, had sent envoys offering to surrender himself and his territory, more out of enmity towards Porus than friendship for Alexander. But when he learned that the former Porus had been released and was now ruling an additional large territory, he fled his own land, fearing not so much Alexander as his namesake rival. He took with him as many warriors as he could persuade to join his flight. Alexander marched against this man, arriving at the Hydrotes, another Indian river, no less broad than the Hydaspes but with a less swift current. He traversed the entire country as far as the Hydrotes, establishing garrisons in strategic locations to ensure Craterus and Caenus could advance safely, foraging much of the land. He then dispatched Hephaestion into the territory of the revolted Porus with part of the army, including 2 infantry brigades, his own and Demetrius's cavalry regiments, and half the archers. Hephaestion was ordered to hand the country over to the other Porus, subdue any independent Indian tribes near the Hydrotes' banks, and place them also under Porus's rule. Alexander then crossed the Hydrotes without difficulty, unlike his crossing of the Hydaspes. As he advanced into the country beyond the Hydrotes, most people surrendered. Some, however, met him with arms, while others who attempted to escape were captured and forcibly subdued. Meanwhile, he received intelligence that the Cathians and other independent Indian tribes were preparing for battle should he approach their lands. They were reportedly summoning all neighboring independent tribes to join their cause. He was also informed that the city of Sangala, near where they intended to fight, was a strong fortress. The Cathians themselves were considered very daring and skilled in warfare, and 2 other Indian tribes, the Oxydracians and Malians, shared their disposition. Shortly before, Porus and Anabasis had marched against them with their own forces and roused many other independent Indian tribes, but were forced to retreat without achieving anything commensurate with their preparations. Upon receiving this information, Alexander made a forced march against the Cathians. On the 2nd day after departing the Hydrotes, he reached a city called Pimprama, inhabited by a tribe of Indians called Adrastians, who surrendered. After resting his army the next day, he advanced on the 3rd day to Sangala. There, the Cathians and other neighboring tribes had assembled and arrayed themselves in front of the city upon a hill, not precipitous on all sides. They had positioned their wagons all around this hill, encamping within them, creating a triple palisade of wagons. When Alexander perceived the barbarians' great numbers and their strong position, he drew up his forces in the order he deemed best suited for the circumstances. He immediately dispatched his horse archers against them, ordering them to ride along and shoot from a distance. This was to prevent any Indian sortie before his army was fully arrayed, and to wound them within their stronghold even before battle commenced. On the right wing, he posted the cavalry guard and Clitus's cavalry regiment, followed by the shield-bearing guards and then the Agrianians. On the left, he stationed Perdiccas with his own cavalry regiment and the battalions of foot companions. He divided the archers into 2 parts, placing them on each wing. While he was arranging his army, the infantry and cavalry of the rear guard caught up. Of these, he divided the cavalry into 2 parts and sent them to the wings. With the arriving infantry, he made the ranks of the phalanx denser and more compact. He then took the cavalry drawn up on the right and led it towards the wagons on the Indians' left wing, as this position seemed easier to assault and the wagons were less densely packed there. Chapter 5. The Siege and Capture of Sangala. The Indians did not charge the cavalry from behind their wagons. Instead, they climbed onto the wagons and began to shoot. Alexander, realizing this was not a task for cavalry, dismounted and led his infantry phalanx forward. The Macedonians easily dislodged the Indians from the first row of wagons. However, the Indians then took a stand in front of the second row, repelling the attack more easily. They were positioned densely in a smaller circle, and the Macedonians were attacking in a confined space. The Indians also secretly crept under the front wagons, assaulting their enemy through the gaps. Nevertheless, the infantry phalanx drove them back. They no longer held the third row, but fled into the city and shut themselves inside. That day, Alexander and his infantry encamped around as much of the city as his phalanx could surround. The wall was too extensive to completely encircle. Opposite the unenclosed part, near a shallow lake, he posted his cavalry. Alexander suspected that the terrified Indians would abandon the city during the night. His conjecture proved correct. Around the second watch of the night, most of them dropped from the wall, only to encounter the cavalry sentinels. The leading Indians were cut down, and those behind, seeing the lake was guarded, retreated back into the city. Alexander then surrounded the city with a double stockade, leaving only the lake as a barrier. He placed more guards around the lake and resolved to bring up siege engines to batter down the wall. However, some men from the city deserted to Alexander, revealing the Indians' plan to escape that very night by the lake, where the stockade had a gap. Alexander stationed Ptolemy, son of Lagus, there. He gave him 3 regiments of shield-bearing guards, all the Arrianians, and a line of archers, pointing out the likely escape route. Alexander instructed Ptolemy, "When you see the barbarians trying to force their way through, obstruct their advance and order the bugler to give the signal. And you, officers, as soon as the signal is given, advance towards the noise with your men. I myself will not withdraw from the action." Ptolemy gathered as many wagons as he could from those left behind and placed them across the escape path, creating difficulties for the fugitives. Since the stockade had been damaged or weakly fixed, he ordered his men to pile up an earth mound between the lake and the wall. His soldiers completed this during the night. Around the 4th watch, just as Alexander had been informed, the barbarians opened the gates toward the lake and rushed in that direction. However, they did not escape the notice of the guards or Ptolemy, who was positioned to provide aid. The buglers gave the signal, and Ptolemy advanced against the barbarians with his fully equipped and arrayed army. The wagons and stockade also obstructed them. When the bugle sounded and Ptolemy attacked, killing men as they slipped through the wagons, they were driven back into the city. 500 of them were killed during their retreat. Meanwhile, Porus arrived with his remaining elephants and 5,000 Indians. Alexander's military engines were being brought to the wall, but before any part of it was battered down, the Macedonians stormed the city. They dug under the brick wall and placed scaling ladders all around. During the capture, 17,000 Indians were killed, and over 70,000 were captured, along with 300 chariots and 500 cavalry. In the entire siege, Alexander's army lost just under 100 men. The number of wounded was greater, over 1,200, including Lysimachus, the confidential bodyguard, and other officers. After burying the dead according to custom, Alexander sent Eumenes, his secretary, with 300 cavalry to 2 cities that had joined Sangala in revolt. Eumenes was to inform them of Sangala's capture and assure them they would face no harsh treatment if they remained and welcomed Alexander as a friend, as other independent Indians who had surrendered voluntarily had suffered no harm. However, the inhabitants of these cities had already learned of Sangala's capture and, terrified, had abandoned their cities and were fleeing. When Alexander learned of their flight, he pursued them quickly. Most of them escaped due to the distant starting point of the pursuit. But all those left behind due to weakness were seized by the army and killed, numbering about 500. Giving up further pursuit, Alexander returned to Sangala and razed the city to the ground. He added its land to that of the formerly independent Indians who had voluntarily submitted to him. He then sent Porus with his forces to the submitted cities to establish garrisons. Alexander himself, with his army, advanced to the Hydaspes River to subjugate the Indians beyond it. He saw no end to the war as long as any hostile force remained. Chapter 6: Army's Refusal to Advance and Return Decision. Reports indicated that the country beyond the Hydaspes River was fertile, its people skilled agriculturists and brave warriors. They also governed themselves in an orderly, constitutional manner, with an aristocracy ruling moderately. This region was said to have many elephants, and its men were remarkably tall and courageous. These accounts intensified Alexander's desire to advance further. However, the Macedonian spirits began to falter. They saw their king piling labor upon labor, and danger upon danger. Throughout the camp, hushed conversations turned into open declarations. The more moderate soldiers lamented their situation, while others firmly stated they would follow Alexander no farther. Upon hearing this, and before the soldiers' disorder and faint-heartedness escalated, Alexander called a council of his brigade officers and addressed them. "O Macedonians and Grecian allies, I see you no longer pursue dangerous enterprises with your former resolve. I have gathered you here to either persuade you to march forward or be persuaded by you to return. If you now disapprove of the labors we have endured and my leadership, then further speech from me is pointless. But if, as a result of these labors, you now hold Ionia, the Hellespont, both Phrygias, Cappadocia, Paphlagonia, Lydia, Curia, Lycia, Pamphylia, Phoenicia, Egypt, Grecian Libya, parts of Arabia, Hollow Syria, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Susiana, Persia, Media, and many other nations beyond Persian rule, the lands beyond the Caspian Gates, beyond the Caucasus, beyond the Tanais, Bactria, Hyrcania, and the Hyrcanian Sea, if we have subdued the Scythians to the desert, if the Indus, Hydaspes, Aces Ines, and Hydrotes rivers flow through our territory, then why do you shrink from adding the Hyphasis and the nations beyond it to your Macedonian Empire? Do you fear future obstacles from other barbarians? Some submit willingly, others are captured fleeing, and still others escape, leaving us their deserted lands to add to our allies or those who submitted. I believe that for a brave man, labors only end when glorious achievements cease. But if anyone seeks an end to warfare itself, know that the Ganges River and the Eastern Sea are not far. I tell you, the Hyrcanian Sea connects to this Eastern Sea, for the Great Sea encircles the whole earth. I will show both Macedonians and Greeks that the Indian Gulf flows into the Persian, and the Hyrcanian Sea into the Indian Gulf. From the Persian Gulf, our expedition will sail around Libya to the Pillars of Hercules. From there, all interior Libya becomes ours, and all Asia will belong to us. Our empire's limits in that direction will be those God has set as the earth's limits. However, if we return now, many warlike nations beyond the Hyphasis to the Eastern Sea remain unconquered. Many more lie between these and Hyrcania to the north, not far from the Scythian tribes. Therefore, if we go back, there is reason to fear that the nations now held in subjection, not being firm in their allegiance, may be incited to revolt by those not yet subdued. Then our many labors will prove vain, or we will have to face fresh labors and dangers, as at the beginning. But, O Macedonians and Grecian allies, stand firm. Glorious are the deeds of those who endure labor and danger. It is delightful to live a life of valor and die leaving immortal glory. Do you not know that our ancestors achieved such glory, becoming a god, or seeming to become one, not by staying in Tiryns or Argos, or even the Peloponnese or Thebes? The labors of Dionysus were not few, and he was too exalted a deity to be compared with Heracles. But we have penetrated regions beyond Nysa. The rock of Aornus, which Heracles could not capture, is ours. Add the remaining unsubdued parts of Asia to those already acquired, the few to the many. What greater glorious deed could we have performed if, sitting at ease in Macedonia, we had merely preserved our own country without labor, simply repelling attacks from border nations like the Thracians, Illyrians, and Tribalians, or even unfriendly Greeks? If I were your commander, free from labor and danger while you toiled, you might understandably grow faint-hearted, sharing only the labors while others reap the rewards. But now, the labors are common to us, the dangers are shared equally, and the rewards are open to all. The land is yours, and you act as its viceroys. Most of the money now comes to you. When we have traversed all of Asia, then, by Zeus, I will not only satisfy your expectations but exceed them. Those of you who wish to return home, I will send back or lead back myself. Those who remain here, I will envy those who depart." After Alexander's speech, a long silence followed. The soldiers neither dared to openly oppose the king, nor wished to agree to his proposal. He repeatedly urged anyone with different views to speak. The silence persisted, but at last Caenis, son of Polemocrates, gathered his courage and spoke. "O king, since you wish to rule Macedonians by persuasion, not compulsion, saying you will lead them or yield to their persuasion without violence, I will speak. Not for myself and my colleagues present here, who are honored above other soldiers, and have already reaped the rewards of our labors, eager to serve you due to our prominence. Instead, I speak on behalf of the main army. And for this army, I will not say what may be gratifying, but what I believe is both advantageous to you now and safest for the future. I feel it my duty to reveal what I think is the best course, given my age, the honor bestowed upon me by the army at your command, and the unhesitating boldness I have shown in dangers and labors. The more numerous and greater the exploits achieved by you, our commander, and by those who began this journey with you, the more advantageous it seems to me that our labors and dangers should end. You yourself see how many Macedonians and Greeks began with you, and how few of us remain. You wisely sent the Thessalians home from Bactra, realizing they were no longer eager for labor. Of the other Greeks, some have been settled as colonists in cities you founded, not all of them willingly. The Macedonian soldiers and other Greeks who continued to share our struggles have either perished in battle, become unfit for war due to wounds, or been left behind across Asia. The majority, however, have died from disease, leaving few out of many. And these few are no longer equally vigorous physically, while their spirits are much more exhausted. All those whose parents are still alive yearn greatly to see them again. They yearn for their wives and children, and for their native land itself. Surely, it is pardonable for them to long to return with the honor and dignity they have gained from you, returning as great men where they departed small, and as rich men instead of poor. Do not lead us unwillingly now. You will no longer find us the same men in danger, as free will would be absent in our contests. Instead, if it pleases you, return to your own land. See your mother, settle the affairs of the Greeks, and bring these many great victories to your ancestral home. Then, if you wish, embark on another expedition against these very Indian tribes to the east, or perhaps into the Euxine Sea, or against Carthage and the parts of Libya beyond. It is now your task to manage these matters. Other Macedonians and Greeks will follow you, young men in place of old, fresh men in place of exhausted ones, and men to whom warfare holds no terrors because they have not yet experienced it. They will be eager to set out, hoping for future reward. They will likely accompany you with even greater zeal when they see that those who shared your labors and dangers in the earlier expedition have returned home rich instead of poor, and renowned instead of obscure. Self-control in the midst of success is the noblest of all virtues, O king, for you have nothing to fear from enemies while commanding and leading such an army. But the visitations of the deity are unexpected, and consequently, men can take no precautions against them. When Caenis finished, his words were met with loud applause. Many even shed tears, clearly indicating their reluctance to face further hazards and their delight at the prospect of returning. Alexander then broke up the conference, annoyed by Caenis's free speech and the hesitation of the other officers. The next day, in anger, he called the same men together again. He declared his intention to advance further, but would not force any Macedonian to accompany him against their will. He would only have those who willingly followed their king. Those who wished to return home were free to do so and report to their relatives that they had come back, having deserted their king in the midst of his enemies. Having said this, Alexander retired to his tent. He admitted none of his companions that day, or for the next 2 days, hoping for a change of heart among the Macedonians and Grecian allies, as often happens among soldiers, making them more disposed to obey. But instead, a profound silence settled over the camp, and the soldiers were clearly annoyed by his wrath, yet unchanged by it. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, states that Alexander nonetheless offered sacrifice there for the river crossing, but the omens were unfavorable. Then, Alexander gathered the oldest of his companions, especially those friendly to him. As all signs pointed to returning, he announced to the army his decision to march back. A mixed multitude shouted in rejoicing, and most shed tears of joy. Some even approached the royal tent, offering many blessings upon Alexander because he allowed himself to be conquered by them alone. Alexander then divided the army into brigades and ordered 12 altars to be prepared. These were to be as tall as very large towers and much wider, serving both as thank offerings to the gods who had led him so far as a conqueror and as monuments to his own labors. Once the altars were completed, he offered sacrifice according to custom and held athletic and equestrian contests. After adding the land up to the Hydaspes River to Porus's dominion, Alexander marched back to the Hydrotes. After crossing this river, he continued his return to the Acesines. There, he found the city that Hephaestion had been ordered to fortify, now fully built. In this city, he settled as many neighboring people as volunteered to live there, along with Grecian mercenaries no longer fit for military service. He then began preparations for a voyage down the river to the Great Sea. At this time, Arsaces, ruler of the land bordering Abassares, and Abassares' brother and other relatives came to Alexander. They brought the most valuable Indian gifts, including 30 elephants from Abassares. They stated that Abassares himself could not come due to illness, and Alexander's ambassadors to Abassares confirmed this. Readily believing them, Alexander granted Abassares the privilege of ruling his own country as viceroy and placed Arsaces under his authority. After arranging their tribute, Alexander again offered sacrifice near the Acesines River. He then crossed it again and came to the Hydaspes, where he employed the army in repairing rain damage to the cities of Nysa and Bucephala, and put the other affairs of the country in order.